May 21st, 2016. Four exhausted climbers stood just 3,000 feet from Everest summit when their Sherpa looked them dead in the eye and said, "Please, back." They didn't, and what happened next would leave bodies scattered across the death zone, loyalty tested to its breaking point, and one climber strapped to his rope in silence forever. Today, we're diving into the chilling moments when Sherpas warned and were ignored. From a man who refused oxygen at 28,000 feet to another who forced his Sherpa past the safe turnaround time, knowing it could kill them both. These are the horrifying stories of Everest climbers who refused to listen to their guides. And wait until you hear how the last climber's boldest move left even his Sherpa stunned. Welcome to the Extreme Edge. Around 8 a.m. on May 21st, 2016, Sherpas Paul, a member of a particular West Bengal team, had just summited Mount Everest. His joy knew no bounds as he began to take pictures to mark his successful feat. However, he had no idea what lay ahead for him, or what had become of his fellow teammates, Paresh Nath, Gautam Ghosh, and Sunita Hazra. But before that, let's rewind to how their story began. It was the group's third attempt to climb Everest. In 2014, they had collectively prepared to summit the mountain and gloriously return to their country. Unfortunately, they didn't even get to climb, as the Khumbu icefall had killed 16 Sherpas and forced a shutdown of the entire session. Sherpas dying should always be a huge warning sign, but the four climbers didn't give up. The following year, 2015, they gathered their resources and made for the mountain. This time around, a catastrophic earthquake shook Nepal. With broken hearts and empty pockets, they returned home with the fame and pride of successful Everesters. But instead of returning to their less adventurous lives, these people's next set of decisions would shock you. You see, they didn't have all the money in the world, or even a quarter of it. Sherpas Paul was not just indebted to his government, he was in debt, literally. Sherpas was poor, and all he had was a truck that he drove to make ends meet. But that didn't stop him from completing basic and advanced mountaineering courses and participating in different expeditions. Because to Sherpas, that was enough experience to attempt the highest mountain in the world. You need to understand how determined and motivated Sherpas was for him to sell the single truck he owned and other properties so he could make his third and final attempt. You might be wondering why he had such an unshakable motivation. Well, in India, successful Everest climbers not only earn respect, they also get financial incentives from the government. As for Sherpas, he wanted all of it. Another willful member was Paresh Nath, a one-handed tailor on a mission to prove something. For Paresh, giving up after failures meant giving up forever. He was already approaching 60 years, so age was no longer on his side. But Paresh had been dreaming of the day he would make it to the highest point of the world, and he wasn't going to live the rest of his life imagining it. So he got help from different organizations, drew resources, and prepared to climb once again. Gautam Ghosh was a soft-spoken police officer, but his friends say you just had to speak about mountaineering to see his eyes sparkle. He had gone on over 30 expeditions and made 14 successful summits. Gautam was not rich, but the support of his family and colleagues kept him going. Unlike others, he had climbed Everest up to 23,622 feet in 2011. He had to turn back when he got injured, but that meant he needed to try one more time. And when he saw another climber in worse condition, he didn't hesitate to save him. That tells us all how kind and selfless he was. As for Sunita Hazra, she was one of the few Bengali women who were attempting mountaineering. Just that tells you of her brave and determined mind. Sunita's love for mountaineering was from birth, and she went on a lot of treks and expeditions as a young woman. Suddenly, she stopped climbing, and by the time she came back, she was already working a government job as a nurse, wife, and mother. Yet, that didn't stop her from going back with her team for the third time in a row. If willpower were all it took to summit Everest, then this team would have gone and returned safely. But soon, that willpower would land them in the kind of tragedy that leaves you with unanswered questions. Tiny detour on this chaos train. If you'd like to be part of the Extreme community, get early access to our videos and exclusive polls, come join us on Patreon. See you there. Aside from experience and physical health, having a good guide or Sherpa is the key to your summit. Sherpas and the other team members had scraped together enough money to book a low-cost agency called Trekking Camp Nepal. Perhaps, if they had waited longer, and saved a few more thousand, they would have gotten a better agency. But they didn't, and Trekking Camp Nepal would go on to provide them with inexperienced Sherpas. There were supposed to be 5 Sherpas for the 4 of them. That made sense. 1 per person and 1 leading the team. Excitement was in the cold air, and everyone was ready to summit this time. They had made their way from the base camp to Camp 1, waiting for their support to join them. The first hour passed, and then the second. Something had gone wrong. Their Sherpas were short of 1, and that was supposed to accompany Paresh. At this point, it was already late, and it began to dawn on the group that they might not get to climb the mountain once again. But Sherpas did not let that thought settle in his mind. He had staked his entire life on this climb, and there was no going back home the same way. Sherpas began to climb his way up. I think his decision to move without waiting for his team shows the amount of mental pressure he had put himself under. When his teammates saw that Sherpas had left them behind, they feared that they would miss out too. If there was a slim chance, then why not take the risk? At first, everything was fine. They had made their way to Camp 4 without any issues, and they even got there around 7:30 p.m., which was standard time. But their oxygen reserves were running low, and this was the final summit push. At this point, the altitude gets extreme and only a few tanks aren't enough. To the Sherpas, turning back was the wise decision. Please back, the Sherpa said. But for the team, that was impossible. Most of them had never made it as far as 26,000 feet. Their dream was only 3,000 feet away. A few hours, and they would prove whoever doubted them wrong. But if you're a lifetime fan of the channel, you know that a few hours in the death zone, actually, a few minutes, can be the difference between life and death. But if you don't know what the death zone is, it's the altitude above 8,000 meters, or 26,247 feet, where the air pressure is so low and the oxygen level is about 1/3 of that at sea level. That means the human body doesn't function properly, and the risk of death is significantly increased. I think this courageous group of people experienced identity and legacy pressures. That is, they had framed their self-worth around the ability to reach the summit successfully. When the mind is caged in that way, turning back would equal failure to them. But the hard part to comprehend is the actions of the Sherpas that would further jeopardize the entire mission. As the group struggled to beat the clock with oxygen levels dropping, they noticed that Paresh and the Sherpa assigned to him had separated from them. Remember that Sherpas and his guide were way ahead of the team, so when the others no longer saw Paresh, they believed he was also on the way up. The next time anyone would see him, he had frozen to death, and they would later find out that Paresh's guide had abandoned the older man and descended. That was not the only abandonment that was going to happen that evening. One after the other guides who were with Gautam and Sunita began to go their own separate ways. Gautam and Sunita were soon alone, frostbitten, and out of oxygen. They had always been the closest of the group, and their unity kept them going until the tragic fall. Sunita fell and began to tumble down the mountain. Usually when that happens, the person lands in crevices, and if they don't get help, the hole becomes their gravesite. I wonder if she was still thinking about her dream in those moments, or her little family back home. But Sunita wasn't going to die that day. An ex-soldier and fellow mountaineer called Leslie Binns was also on his way up the mountain. He had seen her and was waiting to catch her. He saw Gautam too, but Sunita was more critical. Her wrist had broken and her fingers were frostbitten. He took her back to his tent, gave her oxygen, and began to warm up her hands. Once Leslie was sure that she would recover, he turned to leave the cave and help his fellow forceman, Gautam. But just like the team, Leslie had also exhausted his strength, and he had no idea when he fell asleep. It is ironic how Gautam, who once saved a man in 2011 on that same mountain while nursing his injury, was left to die there alone. But it was because he had prioritized Sunita's life, and if that is not heroic, I don't know what is. Sherpas, unaware of his teammates' fate, had successfully summited Everest. He stood there, taking in the feeling that comes with accomplishment. But as he spent more time up there, his Sherpa began to panic. Maybe Sherpas thought standing longer could help recover his strength, but that was a dangerous move that would only cause rapid exhaustion. Once more, his Sherpa begged him to descend, but Sherpas had waited too long to summit. He had to take it all in. When his Sherpa saw that he wasn't ready to listen, he turned around and began to descend alone. By the time Sherpas decided to descend, it was too late. He was almost out of oxygen and had no spare tank with him. Determined to make it back home, Sherpas summoned courage, perhaps hoping to meet someone with an extra oxygen tank. He had only descended back to 27,600 feet when he completely ran out of oxygen. Alone and exhausted, Sherpas collapsed and succumbed to his death. When he was found on the morning of May 22, 2016, his body still tethered to his rope at 26,000 feet. If they had listened and turned back on time, maybe Sunita wouldn't have been the only one to return alive. But would they have been able to live with themselves? I guess we would never know. But this story is not as intense as our next story. Let's go from bad to worse. When Joshua Cheriot Kirui bade his colleagues at Kenya Commercial Bank farewell and began his journey to Mount Everest Base Camp, he was prepared for everything. Well, everything except for what his persistent resilience would cost him. But if you want to understand why Joshua went to Everest, you have to go back to when he was a teenager. If Joshua had never gone with his schoolmates on a trip to Mount Kenya, maybe he never would have become a mountaineer. But from the moment he stared at the second highest peak in Africa, he promised himself that he'd see the world from its summit. And Joshua kept his promise. Not once or twice, but 20 times. Did that shock you? Well, that's not all. Joshua attempted to climb this 17,057 feet high mountain 3 times in a single day, and that attempt was remarkably successful. I think that tells you a lot about his mindset. After conquering all the peaks in Kenya multiple times, Joshua expanded out of his home country and started tackling other mountains like Mount Stanley, and even took the harder routes. But what made him popular was his ascent of Mount Kilimanjaro. The mountain stands at 19,341 feet and is the highest peak in Africa. For Joshua, climbing a mountain was not enough. He always needed more, something that would make his attempt different from the rest. For Mount Kenya, he did 3 ascents in one day. But what he did for Kilimanjaro was even more intriguing. Joshua ascended and descended within 15 hours. To put it in context, the least amount of days typically required to summit and descend Kilimanjaro is 5 days. Of course, including the acclimatization days. But Joshua needed none of that. That Kilimanjaro climb made him popular, and people wondered, what is Joshua Kirui going to do next? No matter what they thought, I doubt if they saw Joshua's next mission coming. In 2023, Joshua decided he was accomplished with African peaks and that a certain mountain in Nepal was next. This time, it was far more dangerous. Mount Manaslu is 26,781 feet high, more than 6,000 feet higher than what Joshua was used to. But he didn't only summit Manaslu. Joshua did it without supplemental oxygen. He became the first African to conquer a mountain that is over 26,246 feet high. Although his health took a hit and he had to be in the hospital for a while, Joshua must have started planning his next conquest in the hospital room. He was going to summit the highest peak in the world and the ultimate destination of passionate mountaineers, Mount Everest. And he was going to do it without supplemental oxygen. Even though he liked to take risks, Joshua was a professional mountaineer who took the right precautions. He didn't try to summit without a Sherpa, and since he had never been on Everest before, he asked the agency he hired, 7 Summits Treks, to make sure his Sherpa was very experienced. However, he was too prepared to return home without a photo of himself on Everest. For someone who had conquered mountains on first attempts, I think he had raised the bar so high that returning home without even trying would feel like a failure. So they left base camp together with only one contingency plan in case Joshua's no oxygen mission went wrong. The plan was an emergency oxygen bottle that Nwang would carry with him. With that in place, they had everything under control. Or so they thought. On May 22nd, Joshua and Nwang left Camp 4, where they had been for several days, and began their final push toward the summit. The weather window was tight. Wind speeds had dropped just enough to allow climbers to move, but time was limited. By the time they neared the Hillary Step, just below the summit, everything changed. You see, back in 2023, when Joshua climbed Manaslu, he had survived not 1 but 2 rounds of high-altitude pulmonary edema, which is an altitude sickness that causes fluid to collect in the lungs, causing shortness of breath. Although Joshua made it out of the hospital, his body had become susceptible to altitude sickness. especially since he only waited 1 year before beginning another climb. So, at just 157.48 feet from his dream, Joshua's body began betraying him. They were in the death zone, and this was where the brain needed all the oxygen it could get. It was time to activate Plan B, and Nawang swung into action. He reminded Joshua about their agreement and offered him the oxygen bottle. Since they were only a couple of feet away, Nawang must have felt relieved because the oxygen would sustain them on their way back down. However, he had no idea the kind of man he was guiding. Joshua turned down the oxygen. While survival was on Nawang's mind, Joshua was thinking of victory. Only a few more steps, he must have thought. Just a few steps, and that dream would be all his. Nawang panicked. He pleaded and pleaded with Joshua, watching him as his health deteriorated faster. At this point, his own life was in danger. He reached out to base camp to tell them that Joshua was unwell and that he was behaving irrationally and pushing him away. Dorchi Sherpa, the base camp manager, told Nawang to put him on oxygen and begin descent. Joshua's response was, "No oxygen, pure summit only." Nawang faced an impossible dilemma. As a Sherpa, abandoning a client without permission from base camp could mean termination or even blacklisting. The job was his livelihood. He couldn't afford to lose it. Nawang also knew that leaving Joshua behind meant certain death for Joshua. His bosses told him to wait and keep trying. And perhaps Nawang was delirious himself. He sat down beside Joshua and watched him with his eyes wide open. I think that moment Nawang surrendered to his fate and sat down is absolutely touching. He didn't continue to climb or try to beg Joshua anymore. He just sat there with his eyes wide open as a final act of loyalty and commitment to his client. Joshua remained on the ropes. However, his tossing and turning made him flip upside down. He stayed in that position for a long time, groaning in pain, and passerby climbers could not do anything to help because helping meant spending more time in that zone and risking their own lives. However, only one climber, Mills, stopped and turned Joshua back. At that time, he was still fighting for his life and even managed to zip his suit, which probably came undone from his tossing violently. Truly, Joshua was tough, inside and out. Unfortunately, that was the last time anyone saw him alive. By the next morning, Joshua had passed away from high-altitude cerebral edema, another type of altitude sickness that affects the brain and makes an affected person delirious. As for Nawang, the ever-loyal Sherpa, he froze over in that sitting position and the strong wind had blown his remains away. I try to imagine how dangling upside down, especially in those weather conditions, must have felt for Joshua and what he would have been thinking in those moments. Did he regret not taking that oxygen when he still could? Did he feel guilty as he watched Nawang's glassy eyes stare at him? Or was he content that his life was about to end on the mountain of his dreams? But just when you think you've heard the worst, the next story makes you pause, sit up and ask, how is this even real? On May 20th, 2017, Ravi Kumar began his ascent on Mount Everest with complete trust in his mountaineering skills. He was prepared for everything, or so he thought, because what would happen to Ravi in the following days was definitely not part of his plans. You see, Ravi Kumar was born and raised in Moradabad, Uttar Pradesh, India, into a modest middle-class household. He worked as a college lecturer in Hindi literature to support himself and his dreams. What set Ravi apart was not his background, but the sheer scale of his ambition. He had always been fascinated by the Himalayas and dreamed of standing on top of the world. For someone from a small town with limited means, it was an audacious goal. It wasn't just about the town, you see. Ravi belonged to one of the most oppressed castes in India. Growing up, he hated how much inequality his people had to go through, so he began to climb mountains as a silent protest against the government. His determination was unrivaled, and by the time he was 27 years old, Ravi had summited all the important peaks in the world, except the one and highest, Everest. But to climb Everest, he needed a lot of money. How was he going to afford that with his lecturer's salary? Well, the answer lies in the spirit of communal love. As a passionate speaker and teacher, he was able to convince people of the importance of his journey, and with the help of local sponsors, Ravi began to gather his funds at the grassroots and even at the institutional level. It was difficult to get money from the leaders of his own caste, but his community members supported him, and everyone held their breath as he left for Mount Everest. I believe that when climbers venture to Everest with financial aid, there is an increased pressure to come back victorious. Somehow, they stop thinking about themselves and start to focus harder on their mission. That was exactly what happened to Ravi. Just like hundreds of others, Ravi began his final push from Camp 4 on May 20th, around midnight. The summit window was narrow, and weather conditions at the time were relatively calm. He ascended alongside his Sherpa guide, Lakpa Wongya, who had summited Everest multiple times. By the time Ravi got to the summit, it was already 1:28 p.m. That time was too dangerous because normally descent starts by noon. But for a man with Ravi's motivation, turning back was impossible. What would he say to those who had contributed to sending him his way? So, when his Sherpa began to insist on their return, Ravi didn't refuse. He forced the Sherpa to continue the ascent with him. He was so sure that he would succeed. Yet, he was indeed right about succeeding in reaching the summit. He placed his country flag on the snowy ground and took pictures there too. He had made his people proud. It was now time to turn back and return to his family. And that's when tragedy struck. Somehow, Ravi fell. Now, when you fall on your descent and there's no one below, only crevices or snow holes can break your fall. The farther away a crevasse is, the greater the effect of the fall on you, especially in extreme weather conditions like on Everest. Ravi rolled almost 656 feet down and into a crevasse. He didn't fall too far, but he had sustained injuries. His Sherpa didn't know how to help other than to leave him there and seek help. So Lakpa struggled and eventually got to Camp 4, but he was too exhausted to shout for help. And by the time Lakpa was found there, he had collapsed and had severe frostbite. Those who found him couldn't get any information about Ravi from him, but his solo climb down indicated something. Ravi's life was in danger. They began to search for Ravi, but after looking for 24 hours, they began to lose that hope. Falling down at high altitude meant not just frostbite, but a possibility of injury or infection. Still, they silently prayed that somehow Ravi was waiting for help to arrive. I can't help but wonder what was happening to him. Was he awake and well aware of his injuries? His injuries that probably hurt 100 times more at that altitude? Did he wonder and hope that someone would come for him? Or did he accept his fate once he fell? Sadly, by the time they found Ravi, he had passed away from the injuries he sustained. I try to imagine if he felt fulfilled as he lay in the crevasse, waiting for death or help. Do you think his short life was spent well fighting for social justice? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section. I think these 3 stories tell tales of sheer determination. Every one of them had their reason to climb, and they knew the risks they were taking. The West Bengal team had tried and didn't even get their chance twice. All they wanted was to show that they could do it. But sadly, their dependence on Sherpas cost them the only thing they had left, their lives. Joshua's risk as reward mindset led him through all his victories and eventually to death. And Ravi, his determination to prove that his caste was as good as any other, led him to climb the highest peak in the world. Yes, maybe if they had listened to their Sherpas, they would have lived another day. But for these people, living was not about just being alive. It was about sacrifice and fulfillment. I think these stories are heroic and full of passion. Let me know what you think about them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay bold and live brave.